I had to read your whole message to him, brother. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what you've been waiting for right here. The evidence from the True Crime Podcast, True Crime Today podcast, was released. Now, I want these people to get on their knees and apologize for that capping ass disrespect they put on my name. Now let's play the tape and enjoy when you in the presence of a boss.
This is a True Crime in Real Time update from True Crime Today and the Hidden Killers podcast.
Let's get one thing straight right from the start. Tony Buzbee is not disbarred in New York. He's not permanently banned from practicing law there. What happened is a lot more bureaucratic, a lot less scandalous, and yet somehow it turned into a headline-grabbing mess. The kind of legal footnote that should have stayed buried in court records, but instead got twisted into something it never was. And that all started with one of the biggest legal battlegrounds in the country, the Southern District of New York, also known as SDNY. Now, if you don't know much about SDNY, here's the deal. It's basically the heavyweight champion of federal courts. Manhattan, the Bronx, and a few other counties. It covers some of the most high-profile, high-stakes litigation in the country. This is the same court that's handled cases against Donald Trump, Jeffrey Epstein, Bernie Madoff, you name it. If you're a lawyer handling big cases in New York, this is where the action happens. And Buzbee, well, he wanted in. But here's where things took a turn. Buzbee, high-powered Texas attorney, known for his aggressive, headline-grabbing style, was filing lawsuits in SDNY without being officially admitted to practice there. And in the world of federal courts, that's a problem. Because unlike state courts, where once you're licensed in one state, you can sometimes get reciprocity in others, federal courts have their own separate admission process. Even if you're an attorney in good standing in New York State, you still have to get admitted to each individual federal court you want to practice in. Buzbee, for whatever reason, didn't do that. He just dove right in, filing lawsuits in SDNY as if that part didn't matter. And for a while, nobody seemed to notice. Until they did. And when they did, it didn't go well for him. The SDNY Committee on Grievances, the group in charge of making sure attorneys follow the rules, caught wind of what was happening and took action. Buzbee had never been admitted to practice in SDNY, and yet he had appeared in multiple cases there. That's like sneaking into a members-only club and ordering bottle service like you own the place. It wasn't that he couldn't be admitted, it was that he never went through the process to make it official. So, what did SDNY do? They denied his application after the fact. When Buzbee finally applied to be formally admitted, presumably because someone tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Hey, you know you're supposed to do this first, right?" The court said, "Yeah, no." Now let's be clear. This isn't the same as being disbarred. Disbarment is when a lawyer gets permanently kicked out, their law license revoked, and they're banned from practicing altogether. What happened here was procedural. SDNY simply said, "We're not admitting you because you already broke the rules by practicing here without permission." It was more of a "you should have asked first" kind of punishment. But of course, that's not how the media spun it. Within hours of the decision, the internet was ablaze with headlines claiming Buzbee had been barred from practicing in New York. Not just SDNY, New York, the entire state. It spread like wildfire. Social media was flooded with posts declaring his career in New York dead, his reputation in ruins. The reality? Buzbee was still fully licensed in New York state courts. He could walk into any New York Supreme Court, which, despite its name, is just the regular trial court in New York, and argue a case tomorrow if he wanted to. The only thing he couldn't do was handle cases in SDNY without special permission. But why did this even become a big deal in the first place? What made SDNY suddenly care about Buzbee's admission status? Well, that brings us to the lawsuit that started it all. See, Buzbee wasn't just filing any random case in SDNY. He was filing lawsuits against some of the most powerful names in entertainment. We're talking about Sean Diddy Combs. We're talking about Jay-Z. And one lawsuit in particular made headlines. A sexual assault lawsuit filed against both Jay-Z and Diddy, brought under New York's Adult Survivors Act, a temporary law that gave survivors of sexual abuse a short window to file lawsuits no matter how long ago the alleged abuse happened. This lawsuit, which Buzbee filed on behalf of a Jane Doe was explosive. The allegations? That Jay-Z and Diddy sexually assaulted a woman back in the year 2000. The timing? Right as Diddy was facing a flood of other lawsuits, including abuse allegations from singer Cassie, his ex-girlfriend. But then, just weeks after filing it, Buzbee's lawsuit was withdrawn. No explanation. Just gone. And that's when the questions started. Why was the lawsuit pulled so quickly? Was there something wrong with the case? Was it a mistake? Or worse, was it filed without proper due diligence? The moment the lawsuit vanished, scrutiny on Buzbee skyrocketed. People started digging, looking for anything that could discredit him. And they found something. The fact that he wasn't actually admitted to SDNY. And so the narrative shifted. Instead of focusing on the allegations in the lawsuit, the media turned its attention to Buzbee. And with the SDNY decision coming down right around the same time, it was the perfect storm. The story became about Buzbee getting barred from practicing in New York, whether it was accurate or not. And Jay-Z's team? Well, they took full advantage. Jay-Z's lawyers were quick to highlight the withdrawal of the case in the SDNY decision, painting Buzbee as an attorney who wasn't playing by the rules. They called the lawsuit baseless and suggested it was part of a pattern of frivolous litigation. And with that, the damage was done. The idea that Buzbee was some rogue attorney who had just been tossed out of New York had taken root. Never mind the fact that he still had a valid New York law license. Never mind the fact that this was all a procedural issue in federal court, not some major professional scandal. The perception was set, and perception, especially in the court of public opinion, can be more powerful than reality. But perception only holds up as long as no one checks the facts. And when you check the facts, a very different story emerges. There's a funny thing about the way legal systems work. To the average person, law is law, a lawyer is a lawyer. And if someone gets barred from practicing, that must mean they're done, right? Finished. Out of the game. Except that's not how it works at all. The truth is, the legal world is full of layers. Different courts, different jurisdictions, different sets of rules that can mean the difference between a headline that says barred from practicing in New York and the reality that Tony Buzbee can, in fact, still walk into a courtroom in the state of New York and argue a case tomorrow if he wanted to. And that's exactly what the records show. The confusion stems from something most people, understandably, don't think about. Federal courts and state courts are not the same thing. A lawyer can be perfectly licensed to practice in state courts, but still needs separate approval to work in federal ones. And that's the case here. Tony Buzbee is licensed to practice law in New York State. That means he can appear in New York Supreme Court, which despite its misleading name, is actually just the main trial court in the state, appellate courts, and any other state-level judicial setting. But federal courts, those are a whole different animal. Each federal court requires its own admission process. Just because you have a New York law license doesn't mean you can automatically walk into SDNY or EDNY, the Eastern District of New York, which covers Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island. You have to apply separately. And that's exactly where Buzbee ran into trouble. He never got admitted to SDNY before filing cases there, which led the court to deny his after-the-fact application. And once that happened, the internet ran with it, turning it into something it wasn't. Because here's what didn't happen. Tony Buzbee was not disbarred. Tony Buzbee was not suspended. Tony Buzbee did not lose his New York law license. And there's proof of that. The New York Appellate Division, 3rd Department, the judicial body that actually controls attorney licensing in New York, has a record of every lawyer admitted to practice in the state. According to their official certification, Buzbee was licensed on January 17th, 2019, and as of early 2025, he remains in good standing. No suspensions, no disciplinary actions, nothing. That's a far cry from the social media frenzy claiming he was barred from New York. Buzbee himself even posted the official court document confirming his status. If he had actually been disbarred or suspended, that certification wouldn't exist. The New York courts wouldn't just say, oh yeah, he's fine. They'd have records of any disciplinary action, and they'd be public. But those records don't exist, because no action was ever taken against his New York license. Which raises an important question. If Buzbee still has his license, why did the SDNY issue blow up the way it did? The short answer? including plenty of journalists, don't understand the distinction between state and federal court licensing. To someone unfamiliar with how the legal system works, hearing that a lawyer got rejected from a federal court in New York sounds a lot like that lawyer being banned from New York courts entirely. It's an easy mistake to make if you don't realize that SDNY and the New York State Unified Court System are completely separate entities. So when the news broke that SDNY denied Buzbee's application, it got twisted into something it wasn't. People saw denied admission and assumed that meant barred from New York. And once the misinformation started spreading, there was no stopping it. Of course, there's also the fact that this story involved high-profile celebrities. When your name is attached to lawsuits involving Diddy and Jay-Z, every little thing about you is going to get scrutinized. And when a procedural issue gets just enough of a scandalous twist, it turns into a story that people can't resist sharing. But here's the kicker. Even if Buzbee had never been licensed in New York at all, he could still handle federal cases there, if he had gone through the right process. Federal courts allow out-of-state attorneys to apply for Pro Hac Vice status, which is basically a case-by-case admission. It's how lawyers from Texas, California, or anywhere else in the country represent clients in federal cases outside their home states. Buzbee could have done that for his SDNY cases, but instead, he tried to get admitted as a full-time member of the SDNY bar after already filing lawsuits there. That's what SDNY took issue with. Not his credentials, not his reputation, just the fact that he skipped a step. And yet, to the outside world, that step turned into a full-blown, career-ending scandal. But if SDNY wasn't the licensing body that controls his law license, who is? That would be the New York State Appellate Division. And, as we've already covered, their records show that Buzbee has had a valid New York license since 2019 and still does. But New York isn't even his main playing field. Buzbee's primary legal career has always been based in Texas, where he's been practicing since 1997. That's almost 30 years of litigation, and through all that time, there's been no record of disciplinary action against him there either. If there had been, Texas, just like New York, would have made it public. That's another reason the barred in New York claim falls apart. If Buzbee was actually disbarred or had some serious misconduct issue, it wouldn't just affect one court. A suspension or disbarment in one state can often lead to reciprocal discipline in others. Meaning, if New York had actually taken action against him, Texas would have been notified, and they'd have their own decision to make. But Texas hasn't taken any action. Because New York hasn't taken any action. Because there was no misconduct charge to begin with, the only thing that happened was that a federal court committee looked at his admission request and said, "Sorry, you should have applied before you started filing lawsuits." That's it. That's the entire story. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a bar fight. It wasn't even a disciplinary matter. It was a paperwork issue that got spun into a legal drama, mostly because it came at the exact same time that Buzbee was handling some of the biggest lawsuits of his career. And yet, despite all this, the misinformation still hasn't fully died down. Because once a narrative takes hold, especially one that involves high-powered attorneys, A-list celebrities, and a federal court rejection, it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. But the records don't lie.